All right. Hi, I'm Dean Gonsowski, and welcome to today's webinar. We are going to be covering a really interesting piece of primary research around data privacy and compliance, and that is powered by the Osterman Research Group. And so I'm joined by Michael Sampson, and we'll get through some housekeeping and a few other intros and get off to the races here in a second. Let's see as I advance slides in Zoom. It seemed easy. Michael, why don't you give us a quick introduction into your background and maybe tell people where you are in the world. I'm sure they wouldn't guess.
Hey, Dean, thanks for the opportunity to be here and to talk about this research that we did in conjunction with yourselves. I'm a senior analyst at Osterman Research. I was the lead analyst on this program, which was focused on privacy compliance and looking at how organizations in the United States were meeting their compliance obligations. I'm based in New Zealand. Osterman Research is headquartered out of Seattle in Washington, and I get to work for Osterman from here. I've been working with Osterman since about 2008, although have only been in the senior analyst role since the beginning of 2021 last year.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And happy to have you here today. We've got we were talking before the call. He's already into tomorrow, so it's an interesting sort of time gap we've got between our respective countries. I am in San Diego and on the west coast of California, so pretty dispersed geographically. Dean Gonsowski, I am the Chief Revenue Officer at Gimmal. I'm an attorney by trade, and I've been doing information governance and e-discovery for about 2 decades, usually with software companies, and no longer practicing, but certainly like to stay up to date on the various legal regulatory compliance issues that face our customers, partners, and prospects. And so let's jump into it today. And I think what's really exciting is to see, actual primary research. There's a lot of commentary and conjecture out there, but this is from the horse's mouth. What you'll see from a housekeeping perspective, we've got Q&A functionality through the webinar. Please go ahead and submit questions. We will endeavor to answer those near the end, and if we can't get to them, we'll send responses offline. We've got a lot of content here, so we'll try not to interleave them as we go. The recording, as it shows there, will be sent out, and so you'll get the recording, the materials, and everything presented. More content than you could possibly imagine. And if you need help, obviously let us know. And with that, let's jump into it, Michael. This research was sponsored by Gimmal. We're happy to do that, and it's a good way for us to better understand the landscape and talk to our customers about future needs that they'll have and what they're seeing out there on the horizon. We've got a suite of different information governance solutions, everything from a Discover solution, which helps identify, analyze, categorize, remediate sensitive information. And so that can often be useful in a data privacy context, to records management, migration, physical records management from an electronic standpoint. And so this is kind of our suite of all the things we do. Obviously let us know if there's anything we can do to help you out as we go down the road. And Michael, maybe talk a little bit about Osterman and the type of work that you guys focus on.
Sure. So Osterman's a market research and consulting company. Our tagline is around delivering insight, trying to look at what's happening across various topics such as cybersecurity, data protection, information governance, and a host of others, and then provide insight that organizations can make better decisions on in terms of what do we need to do differently and better in order to meet the demands, the threats in cybersecurity, the compliance mandates in areas like information governance and compliance.
Yeah, great. And I think what's cool about this research we'll get into is it does hit lots of different groups that are concerned about it. And it's not just data privacy, right? There are a bunch of other disciplines that are involved. This is a shot of the research, which we'll be sending around thereafter, and for you guys to look at your leisure, but we'll give you the Cliff Notes version here as we go throughout our presentation. Maybe hit the survey design real quickly, Michael.
Sure. So we did a survey of 130 respondents in the United States. All of the respondents had to be familiar with how their organization was addressing their privacy regulations and their privacy obligations. Obviously, with the United States having a low series of state-level data privacy regulations in place currently, and more coming. California currently in place, Virginia currently in place, Colorado currently in place, Utah came in place just as we were publishing this item, so there is mention of that. But we know that there are other states working on this as well. So that was really of interest to us in terms of, if you look at what's been going on in terms of the need to protect personal and sensitive data, which has really been addressed through industry-specific regulations up till now, what do the new state-level regulations impose on organizations, and how are they responding? In order to take the survey, the respondents had to work at organizations with more than 100 employees, but the actual average was somewhere over 14,000. And we had no industry restriction in terms of taking it. So we weren't saying, exclude manufacturing or something like that. Whatever industry you came from was fine.
And that's a good point, because I think historically, the only certainly regulated industries. Oh, hi. You'd only see certain regulated industries having to comply with various regulatory mandates. And so I think what's interesting about data privacy is it really is ubiquitous to manufacturing, retail, consumer products, internet, technology companies, whatever it might be. And so we'll jump into that. And I think that's a big change for a lot of companies. They've a number of those that weren't regulated didn't have to be worried about being in the crosshairs.
Absolutely, sure.
All right, well, let's start here. And I think the maturation for data privacy is certainly of interest, particularly with what I've seen with customers is that they're trying to figure out how aggressively on the maturation curve they want to be. They want to be ideally alongside their peers, not too far ahead and not too far behind. And so that is one of the games that people play. And let's take a look at some of the findings. And Michael, you were just talking about the various states, but I think the applicability of all these regulations is really pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the early questions in the survey was, what compliance obligations in terms of data privacy do you have to meet? And we included a catch-all around privacy regulations that are specific to our industry. So 70% of the respondents said, yes, that applies to us. HIPAA for healthcare has obviously been a landmark piece of regulation for quite some time. And so many of the respondents said that that was important for them. Interestingly, although it was a survey of United States organizations, we can see the general data protection regulation from Europe having a foothold in terms of organizations in the United States, physically located in the United States, but working with data subjects in Europe, and therefore being subject to the demands of GDPR. And then we get a range of the state level ones coming in. California, CCPA, CPRA about to come, Colorado, CPA, Virginia, the CDPA. We did not run the survey when the Utah one was in place, so it was not asked, but it would also be noted here, and so on.
Yeah, and I think it's illustrative of this is a patchwork of data privacy legislation, and there's obviously some big bellwether ones that people are concerned about, but even at the state by state level, if you're not in the state, you probably have customers or partners, prospects in the state. So it feels like there's very few that you can skip out on here.
Yeah, and I think the challenge going forward is that organizations are going to have to say yes across a whole range of those going forward. That if you're a healthcare organization, we have to comply with HIPAA, and we have to comply with the California regulations, and we have to comply with Colorado because we have people in that state that we work with, and so on. And so we get this complicated and complex environment that we now need to start addressing as organizations.
Yeah, and that really goes into this sort of the next slide about, maturity and customers' perception, companies' perception of where they are on the maturity index. Pretty interesting here that some folks think they're very mature. I guess that's probably relative, and some folks feel a little bit more not quite as sanguine about their maturity. What's your take on this and sort of the evolution?
Well, it's interesting if you put the next two builds on the slide for me, is that we've got 53% who say that they are mature or very mature. So, the majority of, but only slightly the majority of organizations believe that they currently have a high level of maturity with the privacy regulations that are currently enforced, like HIPAA, like California. And yet 47%, just under half, say that we do not have a high level of maturity. There are still areas that we need to address, still weaknesses that we have in place, still obligations that we have not met for that which is currently enforced. And that doesn't even deal with the regulations that are coming. So for any organization that's in the 47%, then one of the points of this research is that there is work to do.
Yeah, and I like, Michael, here on the mature one, where there's a pretty big drop off between the 41% and the 27%, which is, they feel pretty good where they're at now, but they know they're chasing their tail a little bit with the states that increasingly are coming online, or like with CPRA, right? As I believe it's January of 2023 enforcement. So they know about it, but how it's going to be enforced, tends to be kind of a wild card.
Yeah, and I think that there should be transferable practices. If we're good at data discovery, for example, and we have a mature approach for data discovery currently, then as the new regulations come in, we should be able to leverage that practice into helping us be compliant with the new things that come. If we don't have these fundamentals in place, then we don't have a foundation on which we can build a mature approach. But maybe we'll get to some of those things a bit later on. Maybe I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. I almost went with you there, but let's wait a little bit. Let's talk about the time frame for enforcement. This kind of goes to the last point. There are still lots of things coming down the pike in terms of enforcement. Anything that jumped out at you here?
Well, I mean, once again, it's just the idea that among the regulations that are currently in force, there are implications for not being compliant with this. Only 47% of the respondents were able to say, yes, our organization is there. Another 1/4 of the respondent base said, yeah, okay, we're working on it. We'll be there within 6 months. So good, good to see that kind of momentum. But there's still, a group that are saying it's still quite a way away before we are fully compliant with this.
Yeah, and I think that the danger in that, I've talked to a few folks who will say, we're planning on, insert name here, compliance activity next year. And, I'm sure they are, theoretically, hypothetically, but things happen, right? And so I think that's a little bit of a danger moment for organizations, which is you probably want to start getting going versus, planning too far out in the future, because budgets, prioritization, staff, et cetera, may not be there when you attempt to start it, or it may take longer, right? Everything takes longer than people anticipate.
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps this is the point to jump back to the very beginning of the white paper, which says something to the effect of, organizations have always been much better at dealing with their own confidential and sensitive data, and have been not all that good at protecting the personal and sensitive data of their customers. And so what we're seeing after tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of data breaches, data breaches are a common, news item. This person's been breached, this organization's been breached, is that there is a concerted effort across the world to say, you must do a better job at this, because mere good practice doesn't seem to be doing it. Mere good corporate citizen doesn't seem to be making organizations across the world do this. So this becomes, table stakes in order to collect and work with customer data.
Yep, totally agree. And I think we'll even continue to see some of the ramifications here. As you just highlighted, the assume breach framework, I think is really apparent, right? It used to be, you almost feel like if someone was negligent, they were breached. And then it got to the point where everyone's breached. People, I think it's T-Mobile's had 5 high profile breaches in the last several years. Like it just will be the steady state as we move forward. And so I think this highlights a lot of that. Maybe hit a little bit of the type 1 and the type 2 breach. I wasn't initially familiar with that, Michael.
Yeah, the idea of that is just when I looked at the data, 64% of respondents said that they had been breached by one of those types. So for example, employees' personal data, 64%, we've only had that breached. We haven't also had customers or other sensitive or confidential data breached as well. The 2 types is that we've seen a breach of 2 of those things, employee data and customers, or employee data and corporate intellectual property.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I've worked a bit in this area, and I think one of the things you find is that in the breach, the hackers have the amount of time that they're within the corporate infrastructure means they're spending time. They don't run in and smash and grab and usually obtain a big chunk of data and then run away and sell it on the dark web. They're usually in, and then they spend more time looking for additional sensitive information. And who's to say what kind of sensitive information it'll be? I think you call it some good categories here of intellectual property, healthcare information, private information, financial information. Like they're looking for all that, and then they'll keep looking, and you'll even see some instances where they'll find sort of the honeypot, where they'll find files that have passwords to other systems, and then other helps further the ingress. So certainly you probably, if you did some interesting analysis here, you probably get type 2 and 3 and 4 levels of breaches here as you see those 2.
Yes, and as we'll talk a bit later, it's not only hackers that cause data breaches, but it's also another group that organizations have quite a few of. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Here, one of the key findings was, the early moves. We talk about kind of getting ahead of the curve, so they're not chasing your tail too much. And let's jump into some of these findings as we go. And let me sort of the compliance angle, and I guess sort of the drivers to this are sort of varied, and probably vary depending on the persona and the role that they have within the organization. I would imagine that's probably borne out. These are all pretty significant 60 and 70% kind of level responses. What was your takeaway here?
Look, I think the place that I want to start with this section, where we began with get the early moves in place, such as motivators and data disciplines, is the mental framework that I had when I was writing the report was, as Osterman Research, we're confident that not a lot of people will be fully compliant or doing a great job at this. So rather than taking a big stick to say, bad, 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 you need to do this better, we've tried to take a growth view of this to say, all right, so there are some things that will be working well. There are some things that are not working well. What can we do to encourage and stimulate and help grow the right practices so that organizations across the US and broader start moving in the right direction? So, with that framework in mind, this was one of the early pieces in that section, which was you need to figure out why compliance is important to you. And when we look at the respondents to the survey, this is what they said. Avoiding the loss of customer trust was the most significant issue. Avoiding the loss of corporate reputation was likewise a very highly significant issue. And then some others down here. You're right, Dean, that there's not a lot of variation between the 76% and the 68%. And I think it was something like a quarter of all of the respondents rated all 5 of those as being highly significant to them.
And they feel like they're kind of they're bundled together, certainly to some extent, right? Under the reputational brand diminishment kind of umbrella, and except for maybe the fines piece, right? The fines feel definitely like an externality. And that was one of the things I was reading about GDPR recently, which was, people were lamenting the lack of enforcement around regulatory fines there. But that's just one of the prongs, right? You still will have, even if you don't get fined, you still have all the other brand kind of elements.
Yes, and when I look at these items here, some of them represent a very fragile value. So for example, the loss of customer trust. It can take an organization years and decades to build up a level of trust where the customer says, I'm going back to them, I trust them, they look after me, we've got a good relationship. If you have a significant high-profile data breach where their information is compromised, that loss of customer trust is gone, and you have to start rebuilding that over time. As compared to, like you were just talking about, the regulatory fines, at the end of the day, that's only money. It's not like it's unimportant, but in comparison to the effort that's required to build customer trust over decades, we write a check and we move on. So, it's gratifying to see that avoiding regulatory fines is not the 76% one here, and customer trust is right down the lowest of these.
Yep, good point. There we go. Fragile value and only money. We hit to it. I didn't even animate on it. So we're
that's all good.
Let's talk about the where this data is located, because now we start kind of getting into the nitty gritty. It's easy to say we're concerned about data privacy, and there's some elements around DSAR responses and sensitive data location. One of the things I've seen, I think, is borne out here is that people just don't have a good handle on their data estate. And it seems like some of that was borne out in the research.
Yeah, so the idea behind this chart is we've said, have you carried out an audit on where the personal data is located in your organization? And if you put that next build on for me, please, while 55% say that, yes, we have done a data audit, 45% have said, no, we have not currently done that. Now, a quarter said we'll do it by the end of this year, and then another almost quarter say either we'll do it by the end of next year or we're not going to do it at all. I mean, clearly there's different types of doing data audits, but if you can't see what you have, you can't put the right protections in place to protect what you have. So, once again, with the hat on of saying, how do we grow good practice and best practice in organizations? As Osterman Research, we say, this is something that you need to do. Go out and look to see what personal data you have, because it's likely that you will find places that you were not expecting it to be.
Yeah, Michael, and if there's one thing I've seen over the last several years dealing in this area, is what happens typically is that people will do custodian interviews, and they will do sort of data flows or data kind of high-level data maps, which is, yes, our customer data should be in this type in the repository, et cetera. Should. And then they say, okay, we're good. And then they have DSARs, or they have audits, or they have enforcement actions. And then the question is, well, where is that data actually? And regulators and private citizens and hackers and all the people who are actually more concerned about where the data actually resides, then pressure test some of your assumptions. And I don't think there's any malfeasance to that approach, but it is definitely it's a little bit of a wing and a prayer. We hope all of our data exists where we think it will be, and I think the pressure testing that and starting to see where that data actually does reside is critical, because we've seen in some of the high profile hacks, the Equifax one I was familiar with in particular, was you get data leakage, you get transitory data, you get data that just should not be where it is. It either got stranded, got abandoned, it got replicated. and interestingly enough, you can't see it as the company, but the hackers and the other people who are looking to exfiltrate the data, they're spending the time understanding it. And so to me, that's a pretty big concerning gap for a lot of companies.
Yeah, I mean, I would think immediately of things like customer details in your CRM. You know, where should it be? It should be in the CRM. But as soon as someone in marketing, you know, an intern or an analyst in there goes, let's do an export out of here of everyone who meets these attributes. We'll shove it in an Excel spreadsheet. We'll send it to our external marketing agency for doing a email blast out to them. Suddenly you have a copy on a file share or in SharePoint somewhere. Suddenly you have a copy in that person's email inbox, and you've tripled the footprint where that data is stored, and therefore from where it can be breached, and therefore how it needs to be protected. I mean, my experience with the current version of Outlook is you can't delete attachments anymore in an email message. You can't go, you know, right click, remove. And so if you did want to go back and tidy up those files after you've sent them out, you don't have that option anymore. And so we're creating, by just the way we work, you know, these areas of vulnerability.
Yeah, and I mean, we could probably do a whole sort of session on just these various sort of repositories and data types, because it's so rife with exploitation. I think interesting, I jumped to that last one, which is kind of that shadow IT, unsanctioned cloud applications. I'm guessing that one is way low, particularly with the pandemic and remote work sort of trends that we've seen lately, because people want, you know, they're used to sort of a relatively controlled environment. But we could go down sort of all these paths, but needless to say, they all provide challenges for organizations as they get their arms around, you know, their data estate.
Yeah, the interesting thing, I mean, there's two things to say about that chart. One is there's another half of the chart which is in the white paper, that where respondents say they have better coverage of the data in there. But even so, 60% only, you know, the top number was only 60% for a given repository. I agree with you that unsanctioned cloud apps are highly used and yet unprotected. It's really interesting to me that even that sanctioned cloud apps, though, you know, corporate IT have said, yeah, let's do this, and we sanction it, and, you know, we want you to use this here. But only 43% of organizations were able to say, yes, but we have the ability to see what personal and sensitive personal data we are actually storing in the cloud apps that we have sanctioned as an organization. There's been the onboarding from an IT point of view, but there hasn't been the onboarding from a compliance and data privacy point of view. I mean, SharePoint there, data in Microsoft 365, you know, how many 100 million companies are, you know, individuals are using this, and yet only 41% say we have the controls in place to do something about this.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Well, let's jump into next, and this one I think is sort of rubber meets the road, which is who cares about this issue, and it's not usually a singular person or persona or role, and maybe some of the earlier comments about brand diminishment and fines and those all probably triangulate to different people. What was your take on some of the organizational alignment here?
I draw a difference between oversight and participation or involvement. This chart was designed to say who has oversight for it, who has final responsibility in your organization, and there's a group of approaches, or there's a range of approaches. As long as one of those is being used, then as Osterman Research would be saying, yeah, great. Good. You know, we're glad you have somebody or some group that is responsible for this, because someone needs to be. But there is a level of participation and involvement that is much wider than the groups that are listed here.
Gotcha. I'm curious about, we use none of these approaches. Did you have any open tech? Did anything jump out for the for that group?
Well, we had a number of organizations that said we have low maturity in these areas. So I didn't do a correlation of the data, but my assumption looking at this is that those that have low maturity have not yet created organizational oversight. And so again, with the hat on of saying, how do we encourage people to grow in the right direction? This just says, choose one of these approaches or a couple of these approaches and work out a way of making it work across your firm.
Yep. All right. The next wave, you started to allude to various states that were coming online or will soon to be coming online. Never mind federal preemption, which we probably won't have time to get into, and it's probably even further off. But the next wave probably is a big driver for folks. And what was your take here on some of the solutions people were thinking about deploying and were in the process of deploying?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of using that term next wave, I'm definitely thinking that there's going to be more state level data privacy regulations in the United States. And we've got 4 of your states that currently have it. Many others are working on it. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be complex. There's going to be a patchwork of requirements across the states. And if you have to be able to geo-identify where someone comes from in order to figure out what rights you have to extend to them, this by implication demands a very high level of maturity. It would be a lot easier if there was a federal regulation that applied across the board, but we do not have any signaling that that is something that is coming soon. So there are organizational attributes that need to be improved from a maturity perspective. There are also solutions that can be deployed to improve posture. Now, I'll just signal to our listeners that this chart is spread across 2 slides. It's sorted by the order of importance that the respondents to the survey said, and I have called out 5 of the areas from 1 through 5, where 5 is the lowest, where there is the greatest variation between what respondents in general said was important and what respondents said, or for which respondents said they currently had effective or extremely effective approaches. So for example, this last one here, you can just go back to that previous slide, yep, please. Methods for verifying the identity of customers. It's important or highly important to 73% of organizations, and yet there's the 5th highest variation between importance and effectiveness. Privacy awareness training, so working with everyone across the organization that touches or has access to customers or employees' personal and sensitive personal data to know what their obligations are. This also was one of the top 5 in terms of variation between how important we rank it and yet how effective we rate the solutions that we have in place. Dean, if you jump to slide 20 for me, please. This has the other 3 of the top 5. So data classification, the ability to say this type of data in this type of system represents personal or sensitive personal data, was the top area where there was a variation between how important it was and how effective currently deployed solutions were. Data access management and reporting was the 2nd highest. Data encryption for data in use was the 4th highest of those top 5. But in every case, there's a variation between how important we say it is and how effective organizations said their current solutions were. So there's some work to be done here to improve posture. Yeah, and there's a lot of really good stuff in here. I was just sort of thinking in terms of what we see day in and day out. You know, Gimmal works a ton in information governance and retention and deletion. And I think there's a camp which is ties to data minimization. You've got a lot of data. If you can control the surface area, you can, and you go back to maybe this one here under data discovery, right? If you can understand what you have, you can classify it, you can govern it, you can retain it, you can delete it. There's a sort of camp of how do you just minimize your footprint? And then there's a whole other sort of range of let's encrypt and let's protect and do a bunch of other technical things as well. And they're not mutually exclusive, but to me that was kind of jumped out as being able to kind of for the first time really start to
address what it means to have data minimization by design. How do you get
Sure.
rid of legacy data repositories and file shares and data sprawl and all these things that have been accumulating for years, quarters, months, decades for the organization. And I think that's a big lift for a lot of organizations. And the rest, quite frankly, you can't encrypt petabytes and petabytes of information that are out there. You have to try to reduce the scope, and that's what we're seeing in a lot of our customers too. Okay, let's keep
on the
going.
previous slide, the one that I
sorry,
hopefully we won't go on for 6 hours. We probably could. The one on the previous slide that I think is really important, yes, thanks, is the methods for verifying the identity of customers. You know, given the cybersecurity work we do, one of the common things we see is credential breach. So credential stuffing attack, or a password spray attack, or a phishing attack that results in someone's credentials being stolen. How does an organization verify that the person requesting the exercise of a data right is actually the correct person? You know, maybe I've stolen someone's credentials and now I have asked for all of the data that you hold on me because I'm impersonating that person. What controls does an organization have in place to assure that they are not unwittingly creating a data breach against themselves by giving a hacker who has someone else's credentials access to their data?
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. That's a whole separate exfiltration method right there. Well, let's keep going. We've got some more good stuff to cover. So let's talk about sort of classifying data, because that is, you know, a challenge for organizations. I'll just jump in first and go on the far left side, just because what I've seen in a couple decades doing this, requiring employees to manually classify their data either falls somewhere into the it will never work or it will work poorly. No one has the time, and when they do it, they pick the first thing on the list and they just want to get it over with. And so if there was a thing that I've seen fail in information governance land, it's asking employees to do anything. I know that's maybe unduly skeptical, but what's your take, Michael?
Well, I think it's absolutely true. And I mean, we saw moves in the SharePoint world initially around manual classification, and then we saw things like setting classification at a folder level so that classification labels would be inherited when someone dropped a document in there. But I totally agree with you that asking an employee to manually classify their data might work for the perfect people who work in records and compliance, but for everyone else, nah, it's not going to happen. So, I mean, this slide just shows that there are newer ways, better ways of getting to this, you know, rules-based classification. If this, then put this label on it, great, but you still have to maintain a list of rules. We would expect and we would hope that the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning for doing classification for organizations, one, will increase to at least the level that's shown here, but also will prove to be a highly effective approach of enabling much better classification.
Yeah, and I would say this because I've worked in and around AI and ML in both e-discovery and governance context, and there's no doubt that it is useful. I would suggest to people, though, that you'd be surprised how well rules-based approaches work, and they also work a lot more transparently and at scale and simply. And so part of one of the challenges is, yes, AI clearly will be the future. When you throw AI at a lot of undifferentiated large data sets, it's not the magic easy button that people think it will be. And so,
well, if you haven't trained your models, there's no way for it to say this is what we do as an organization. Sure.
Correct. And so I think there's a little bit of yin and yang between sort of rules and turning.
That's a good call. Yeah.
Yeah. The AI and the ML gets the rules better versus sort of just, you know, the easy button to like point AI and ML at it, which I know people want to do, but tends to not work as well as they think.
Yeah. I don't know if it's in this research that we make a comment around. Oh, yeah, we do actually. So, I mean, in the report, it just says AI ML still requires human oversight to ensure that private data is not inadvertently misclassified and thus unwittingly exposed. So there, yes, it's not the panacea. It will help us get towards a much better place, but it's not by itself the only answer.
Yeah, and for me, the sort of data at transit, data at rest is a relatively new term. Maybe explain that for some folks who might not be as familiar with it and how that was kind of used on this slide.
So we were asking what portion of your data under these three different use cases are you protecting using encryption? Yeah, different types of encryption. So data in transit, when I send something to you by email or some other mechanism, is it encrypted? When it's at rest, when it's stored in our systems, either on premises or on someone's machine or in a cloud repository somewhere, is it encrypted there? And there's a growing set of capabilities around encrypting data in use. So there's a whole, that's a whole other conversation that we're not going to be able to get into today. But there are mechanisms, homographic encryption and so on, for keeping private and sensitive private data protected even while it's being used in models and in calculations, which therefore decreases the likelihood that a bad actor, either internally or externally, can get access to it.
Yeah, and there's probably, practically some different solution sets that work across these different repositories for folks who aren't as familiar. So data in transit, at least in my mind, Michael, sort of like DLP level data coming in and out of the firewalls and moving around, and data at rest.
Secure file transfer.
Yep. Yeah. Data at rest may be data in file shares and just sort of hanging out in repositories. Typically doesn't get as much scrutiny for a lot of organizations because they have those other solutions kind of work when data moves. So yeah, certainly another interesting angle here for organizations.
Yeah. And sorry, I said homographic encryption. I should have said homomorphic encryption. It's too early in the morning here. That's the solution that we're looking at for data in use.
I didn't know well enough to correct you, so you got that one past me. What about this sort of data subject rights? I think everyone, at least feels like a lot of people focus on DSAR and that element of the process.
Sure.
But there's that, but there's a lot of sort of subtext to that and what that really means. And what did the survey kind of call out here?
So, once again, from the perspective of how do we encourage and grow good practice, this slide says among the respondents to the survey, only 60% said that they had effective or extremely effective approaches to meeting the DSAR's requirement. How do we give a data subject person the access to the data that we hold on them? Only 60% said we have good processes in place for that. The other 5 that we asked about were less than that. But when you look at this range of rights that a range of data privacy regulations are extending, then there is a need to increase the level of effectiveness, the level of coverage, the level of thinking that has gone into all of these rights. I mean, there's things like, right to opt out of data processing. 42% say we have effective or extremely effective approaches. What this means is that a data subject can say, I do not want you to use my data in your models, or I do not want you to use my data in the way that you analyze a market space. And so, again, there's a level of maturity required by an organization to be able to tag that demand, that request, so that anytime a process happens within the organization, that data is excluded, and to be able to prove that to an individual. There's a whole lot of stuff here that requires time, attention, energy, funding to get this right.
Yep, I agree. We could probably spend a bunch of time here, but let's make sure we keep moving and make sure we get to all of our good content and some questions as well. The employee threat to privacy compliance, right? So we've talked about breaches, but obviously this is, the internal threat actor, either accidentally or otherwise. What looks like the accidental piece comes comes at the top, right? People just make mistakes and get phished and hacked and just forget, right? Get laptops stolen and a bunch of things like that.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, this chart comes from a question that just says, what are the issues that threaten compliance with you? And it's fascinating that there are 4 issues that are quite highly rated that are all caused by internal people. It's not really fascinating. It's a very common thing that we see, but it's your employees that have access to the personal and sensitive personal data in your organization day in, day out. And if there aren't the appropriate protections in place organizationally, training-wise, for awareness, systems that enable employees to go, whoops, I shouldn't be doing this. The system has just told me that I'm about to commit a breach by doing what I'm doing. If you haven't protected your internal people, then you're not protected. So if you put that next build on, I think there's an arrow that just says, look, there's the threat actor of the employee, accidental mistakes. Adoption of unsanctioned cloud apps by employees. We've seen a huge move to work from home over the last 2 years due to the pandemic, and organizations have generally said, just make it work, whatever you have to do, just make it work so we can keep going. And yet we've seen this explosion of sanctioned, unsanctioned IT services where employees are now storing personal data, and some others here as well. Deliberate data theft by trusted employees. Thankfully, that's the least common employee threat, but it's still an employee threat for 27% of organizations.
I was just say I'm surprised. I'm not surprised that that's last. I mean, fortunately it's last, but that's still pretty high, right? That feels like
it is still pretty high. Yeah,
that's a non-trivial number there.
And maybe because people are working from home and we don't have manager eyeball to eyeball with an employee, and we don't have some of that context, and we don't have the visibility and all of that sort of stuff, maybe that's part of the reason why it's as high as it is.
Yep. All right. What about using?
However, just one other thing that
I
think about that, saying that 27% say that it is a high issue doesn't necessarily mean that that's an issue of frequency. It can also be an issue of magnitude. If I, as a trusted employee, have access to the 100 million customers that we have in our systems, and I can capture that and breach that, one employee creates this massive effect across the entire organization. So maybe some of that's coming through.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And in terms of managing some of this, right, this gets into training and the like. What jumped out here as good preventative measures?
I think all of these things go together. The key point that I make in the research is that some of these, like our employee code of conduct outlines appropriate usage of personal data, it's a statement of expectation. It's not a technical solution. We offer training to employees on complying with privacy regulations. It's a statement of expectation by an employee, but it doesn't actually stop an employee doing something that is wrong. So access controls help. Pseudonymization is used to hide or persistently protect data. Absolutely can provide technical ways of dealing with this. So when I look at this slide, I'd say, yes, you need the statements of expectation, but there needs to be more work done to provide the enforcement of expectation through appropriate technical solutions.
Yeah,
I mean, the access controls limit what employees can access. Yeah, that's great. But if we're not carefully managing what employees can access as they move roles and, as we acquire new people, then we start to get to a space where our access controls are out of date and people are able to access what they shouldn't be able to access. So, I mean, even that is an issue that we have to get this right and mature. Otherwise, we have significant issues.
Yep. No, that makes sense. All right. Well, let's jump into the finish line here, and then we'll see if we can get a few minutes for questions if there are any. So what would you say? I guess we'll do the animation builds, allow you to hit them one at a time.
Yes, thanks. So when you put a hat on of going, all right, so, so what? We've talked through all of this stuff. So what does an organization do now? Our recommendation would be something like this. Assess your current compliance posture. Look at what it is that you have to comply with. Look at what it is that you have to deal with today, what's currently working, what's not currently working. If you go to my next build, then there are some current requirements that you have to meet. There are some forthcoming requirements that you have to meet. Where are the gaps between what you're currently doing, what you have to do, and what you'll have to do coming up? And then the final one is is around making a plan to address those shortcomings and to start to grow some of the practices that are needed in order to improve where you're at.
Yeah, and I would just chime in. I certainly agree with all these. I would suggest that that this is a journey you don't need to go on alone. There are lots of good organizations that are doing this. They have assessments and multi-step guides and
Good call.
Yeah, and they just do that, and they're doing this across a number of different companies that will be like like size, complexity, vertical, regionality, etc. And this is complicated. There's no, as you saw, between the patchwork of legislations and then what you do about it, and how you fix it between policy and technology and people. There's not a simple answer, and many of the regulations, probably frustratingly so, don't tell you exactly what to do. They tell you about a standard of care, and then you have to build responsibly, but with your own sort of create your own adventure to that standard of care. And that's where I think a lot of organizations, consultancies can help you figure that out, and then stage what you bring in. You mentioned some pretty deep things like pseudonymization and DLP and data discovery and records management. There's all these things that are out there. None of them are really mutually exclusive. So you often have to figure out, where do you start, and how do you align the various technologies? Because they'll clearly all help, but they might be better staged, in one fashion than another.
Yeah, I think just building on what you have added, which I think absolutely is right on topic, is that this idea of not well-defined standards in the regulations, like a level of reasonable care or within a good amount of time, that kind of language. It made me think of the situation at one of the banks in South Africa where they had a data breach. The regulation in that part of the world said something to the effect of, you must notify the regulator within a reasonable amount of time of this. The bank took 9 days, which they thought was a reasonable amount of time, and the regulator slapped them with a fine for taking too long. So, reasonable time is not 9 days is what you take from this, but that's not what the regulation says. So there's this ongoing need to be aware of how these things are changing across the world for that which is required by you.
Yep, and that's a great point, and goes back to sort of what is reasonable, and what is reasonable is being done by your peers, and so you almost by definition need to know what your peers are doing to be able to decide how you should act. Happy to. I'll go switch to the Q&A window here in a second if I can pull it off. But there's us. There's our contact information, and bear with me. And Austin, you may need to help me figure out how to get to my Q&A window. Oh, let's see. All right. Please submit questions if you haven't already. And I'm checking our framework right now. The people are probably looking forward to reading the actual research and digesting it further. Michael, did you? I don't know if you've received any specifically questions sort of through the application. If not, we can start to wrap up, and we'll send a follow-up to the attendees today, and we'll get them this great research that you guys put together.
Thanks. Yes, I have no questions through Q&A or chat.
Okay.
It's been great to talk to you. Hopefully people from the audience can see that we're quite passionate about this and interested in how we can help move organizations forward. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk with you, Dean. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Michael. Have a good rest of your day. And for the audience, thanks for joining. We'll send this out and give the white paper a good read. I think we only scratched the surface. There's tons of great information in there. And from the Gimmal perspective, let us know if there's anything we can do to help you as you embark upon your journey. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michael. We'll talk to everyone on one of our subsequent webcasts.